So, yeah, I'd like to just start moving through the rest of the lessons. We've been dealing with lesson 1 to 4, just reflecting on that. We'll start with 5 and just intensify some of the principles. Speak into it from this question, a new question. What does it say to us about religion? Helping us get ready for whatever is happening in these movements across the world that are operating, living, thriving. These movements, folks, are in the tens of thousands. They've turned to Christ in the Muslim world, and they've remained in it. And the level of devotion and commitment would embarrass the churches of America.
That's right.
But they're different. They come from a different religious tradition. And they're dealing with the forms and interpreting how God can use that in their own life. This is the world of their first birth. And they don't believe that God wants to dishonor it with the second birth. And so they thrive in the second birth, where they are in the world of their first birth. And if you think about that, yeah, God's in the business. We're going to look at some of that in these next lessons. We'll start with lesson 5. One of the things you notice in the Samaritan woman story is, with a Samaritan and a Jew, that often religion is way more about community and identity than it has anything to do with theology. It's all about community, maintaining community, honoring community, and living out your identity and your role in that community. That's what religion primarily is for most of the world. That's not to say that that's where it's to remain. It's just that's the meaning of religion in the world. So in lesson 5, we're dealing with Acts. We're dealing with this unleashing of the gospel. Love that word. The question for us is, do we really unleash the gospel? Well, the issues that we have as a Christian movement, and especially as an American movement, is to kind of manage and control the outputs and the results. Do we really do like James and the others and say, except for 2 or 3 things, we release the gospel? We trust what God is going to do. The gospel is more powerful, and the Spirit's more powerful than what we can control. We cannot contain it. It's obvious. Unleash it. Love that word. It's a statement that we need to affirm. In this whole subject of moving into lesson 5, we're dealing with Acts, and I'd like to look at a very favorite passage of mine, and that is Acts 10. And this is the story of Peter and Cornelius. Now, you're a biblically literate crowd. I don't have to go into this story, but it is a remarkable story when it comes to the question of interreligious communication and the emergence of the church. It has more to do with the hermeneutical process of the missionary than it does with the other religious world. Doesn't it? It has to do with Peter on a rooftop having a huge Levitical nightmare come down on him and say, kill and eat. His entire imaginary of what God is about in the Gentile world is being challenged with this one powerful trance. Kill and eat. No, Lord, not me. There's an irony in that. Lord, no. It shows the reticence of our religious tradition. And this is a holy tradition. This is the Jewish tradition. This is our biblical tradition. And this is a religious issue. It is not a cultural issue. It is a religious issue that Peter is told, change your religious map. What I call clean, do not call unclean. It is in God's power to determine in that other religious world what is clean. This is an interreligious passage. Peter says, you yourselves know, speaking to Cornelius there in the household, how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone or another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Let me tell you something. Peter looks like he's bungling, but I'm telling you, he has a lot more to him than I do. Because against everything he understood, he followed the voice. He knew the voice. And he could step. That is such a prophetic statement to me, because one of the values in my life is I understand it and then I'll do it. If I don't understand it, I won't do it. Peter did not understand. He was perplexed. And he followed the voice. That is a powerful statement to Brad Gill. But this whole subject of clean and unclean, it moves right across the interreligious world. All the borderlands have it, especially in a place like India. There's a powerful story I learned as a young man. I was out studying to go into mission at Fuller Seminary, and one of the women walking through the halls, B.V. Subama, was from a very high caste Hindu background. And her story in an abbreviated way was this. She could tell her story, and it's in her book, and she had come to Fuller to study how to reach her people. Who were her people? The Brahmin. The 60 million. Very high-class Brahmin. 60 million. There's hardly any evidence except for individuals who have come to Christ here and there. But there's no powerful movement amongst the Brahmin of India. I can be checked on this, but I've heard nothing spoken to this in terms of statistics, just where it's happening. So she speaks from that world. She, like many others in the early part of the 20th century, had grown up in a British educational system, and the Bible was a part of that education in India. And so was English. And so she would study the Bible. She was turning to Christ even as a high schooler. She came into college. And the day came, she knew what God had done in her life. She knew what Jesus meant. And there was only one option for her. And it was to walk down the pathway from her Brahmin village, down the pathway to the Dalit untouchable village, and there join the church. And this was cultural suicide. And so you know these stories probably, but hers was a profound one where, she had to learn how to eat meat for the first time. And she was sick for months, for years, after living what she had. But anything to become part of the church, she would go for it. And so part of what's happening here is the study of a pathway. The study of a pathway. And in the story of Acts 10, you have a pathway. It's from Joppa, where Peter is, down a pathway. All the social shame and the potential loss of social capital that Peter was going to lose with all his religious world by walking down that pathway. It's not for me to associate, to walk across the threshold of this house. He could lose everything. And so what we see in Acts is the willingness of the church to walk the pathway of costliness. But in the story of B.V. Subama, you have someone who had to walk the opposite direction and lose everything. It's a wonderful story because over the years, through her acute way of understanding how to work, many of her household turned to Christ. Many of her family did. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. So this whole subject of what's clean and unclean, and the way in which we as a church have a value system, have a sense of what's worth, what's important. We categorically assign certain value to some things and to other things. We have a way of religiously doing this. Peter's being challenged. It is part of the hermeneutical experience of the missionary, that you live with this type of shock, this type of warping of your value system that presses you into a hermeneutical cycle of going back to God, going back to scriptures, trying to understand, is this God? Is this really you, God? Are you really doing this? Or am I just... This is the experience. These surprises are happening now across the world in these movements. Another great statement in this is in verse 44. While Peter was still saying these things, he's given a great sermon. While he's in the middle of a sermon, the Holy Spirit fell on all who heard the word. And the believers from among the circumcised who had come with Peter, traveled with him, were amazed because the gift of the Holy Spirit was poured out even on the Gentiles. Who would have thought? Our wonderful method, our wonderful understanding of the process by which God moves got interrupted. That's what happens here. They're amazed. The Holy Spirit's not supposed to come upon them. Circumcision is important. A water baptism is important. Then come. No, he interrupts everything with the Holy Spirit coming and endorsing what he's doing in this household of Cornelius. It's his stamp of him working, in a sense, on the other side of the wall. I've been working here. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. There's a great quote by John Barclay, a great New Testament scholar out of England, that speaks of what happened here. It is when they witness the scandalous gift of the Spirit to the Gentiles that Jewish observers are shocked into recognition that the Christ event cannot be confined within the parameters of their tradition. It cannot be confined within the parameters of their tradition. Welcome to mission, folks. That's what it's about, often. A couple of things here, just to need to move quickly through this because we're losing time. But in Asia, according to Simon Chan, the primary locus of religious life is the home. Do you see that here? Cornelius' household. I mentioned it earlier with the story about Sam. Often in East Asia, especially in the subcontinent, the household is the center of religious life. The temple is important. The temple is vital. The family, the home. In the Buddhist world, tremendous challenge. And Chan goes into this in the whole way in which the gospel is moving. How do we respect the household? How do we respect the family, the hierarchy of it? Because often these movements, that's what happens. The family is honored. I think one of the things you also see here is what you might call the separatist hermeneutic. We develop a hermeneutic, one world looking at another world, one religious world looking at another religious world, and we expect a certain separatism to be taking place. And I can still remember traveling as a young man, first time into Southeast Asia. I was in Medan, a little town, big, actually Fairmount City up in Sumatra. And I'm a greenhorn. I was speaking to 250 students, college students. And I can still remember I'm halfway through my talk. I'm struggling, a young greenhorn, an American trying to speak. And halfway through my talk, there's this minaret sticking up on the other side of the wall. Talk. And the call to prayer happens. Allahu Akbar! And what struck me, it still strikes me today, is is the proximity of the Muslim world, but such a heavy separation from what was on our side of the world in this Christian college group. They were from Christian homes. They're from a Christian world, that part of Asia. And there was the Muslim world. So it's not just geographical distance. The proximities build prejudice and worlds that interreligiously just don't relate. Have you heard this quote yet in your class? That today, it says, I can still remember a number of years ago, I have a brother-in-law named Todd Johnson. And Todd is, he runs the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. He's a demographer of the Christian movement. He's quoted in the New York Times and everything. He's quite a guy. And he had me for breakfast. I was up where he was in Boston, and we had breakfast. And I'm trying to talk to him about how things going. And he's got these papers shuffling in front of him. And what it is he's saying, hey, I got a question I've been asking. We've been trying to figure out from the data just how many Muslims in the world know a Christian. Do you think that's important, Brad? That, because that's the question we have. And he said, from what I can see right here is we think about 86 to 80%, 7% of the Muslims in the world don't know a Christian. And often these Muslims live right next door to a Christian. They live close by. There's proximity, but the prejudice. So that's what we're seeing here in this dynamic of there can develop in us kind of a separatist hermeneutic. But I want to finally spend some time on the last passage I want to spend on is Acts 17, very familiar passage. It says so much about ministering in another religious world. Acts 17 is where Paul comes out of Thessalonica and Berea, and he ends up in a kind of a pit stop there in Athens. And he's waiting, and he decides, I'll go to the synagogue. And so he heads up to the synagogue, he ministers there, he goes down into the marketplace. You know the story, right? He goes down to the marketplace, he's there, and there's these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who are banging around the marketplace. They find him, and they drag him up, they bring him down they take him down a path, an up a path, into the Areopagus to Mars Hill, because they want to hear what this babbler is talking about. You know the story. And so he starts to unfold there when he has the opportunity. Paul speaks into how he feels. It says his heart is provoked, disturbed by the idolatry. So there's this whole set of emotions that we have in this other religious world. You can see the idolatry. But Paul doesn't leave it there. It's almost like he gets a grip on his senses, and they ask him to speak. He says, as I was coming up here, I was walking through the idols, and I noticed just one called the unknown God. And he dips into their ignorance. He says, I want to speak to who that God is. So he was provoked within his spirit, but he knew that there within that idolatry, he had his opportunity. And he speaks into their ignorance of their unknown God. There's quite a history to what that idol is, and scholars speak to that. Can't go into that now, but Paul speaks into it, and it's a wonderful, what you see happen in the next portion here is a sermon you don't see anyplace else. It's a different sermon because it's a different audience. He's not in the synagogue. He doesn't have a biblically literate crowd. You step back. What do they think of God? How do you come at this? And so he says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven, does not live in temples made with hands. And he digs into who God is as a creator. He speaks into that, and somebody says, God, is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. He's quoting a great poet from their Greek religious world. And even as some of your poets have said, for we are his offspring. His sources are not just biblical. He's moving within and using pagan sources to communicate truth. Being then God's offspring, he actually uses their poetry as a premise upon which he then says, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. What you see here is what I would like to call the dialectic, or the conversation that goes on between that religious world and our religious world, all for the purpose of communicating. All for the purpose of communicating. I had a professor in seminary who I actually did an exegesis of this, as part of my biblical studies. And he ended up talking on this passage after I handed in my paper. I was very intimidated by that because I didn't have the benefit of listening to this guy. He's a great New Testament scholar. And he said, at this point, he went through this whole thing, and I was learning all sorts of things. Oh, I should have put that in the paper. Oh, yeah. But towards the end, he said, this is a great New Testament scholar, has major commentaries on the New Testament, Gordon Fee. He said, I don't know what God is doing here. No, I don't know what Paul is doing here. I'll never forget it, that moment. I don't know what Paul is doing here, but let me tell you, we do. We do. He'll grab from any source that potentially is a truth that can help an audience in another religious world accept and understand that God has done a new thing in Jesus Christ. He's showing us how to do that. So one of the first things that happens in this type of interreligious communication is the whole subject of terminology. You see it here. The word God, for instance, that finding new terms. In the Muslim world, tremendous debate over this. Can you use the word Allah for God? We can spend a lot of time on that one. Why don't we just watch Paul here? Paul chooses the word theos. Here's how one scholar, Gregory Dix, says, the word God, theos, was liable to shift its meaning considerably in its translation from Aramaic or Hebrew into Greek. From the realm of the living God revealed in the Old Testament to the realm of the gods many and lords many of mythology, whose substance was only poetry and whose morals were at best human fancy. That's what you had in the meaning of theos. Paul used it. Paul used it because the whole Septuagint had used it. 250 years earlier, the Jews amongst the Greek world had decided to translate from Hebrew. They weren't speaking Hebrew that much out there. We have to translate it into Greek. And so Paul was pulling some of these terms. They had chosen Greek terms and then allowed them, just like we see in the Old Testament. They borrowed a term, and it needed to be redeemed. It needed to be transformed. The meanings had to fill out, but it was from the Greek world. It was theirs, and it needed to be changed. So terminology is part of the challenge. One of the things that Lamin Sena, one of the great African missiologists, points out about chapter 1 of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word was with God. Word is the Logos. Christians received a tremendous bonus from the Greek religious tradition. A bonus they were successful in turning to their own good. This was the case with the Logos concept, a concept that went deep back into the Greek world, the whole concept of wisdom, but it had a cosmic, almost like a Star Wars force to it. No personality out there in the ontological understanding. No person. No, just a force. And they took that concept because that concept of wisdom that they had used in the Septuagint that came through the biblical tradition, they could bring that in and could redeem this word logos. And you see it here in the Gospel of John. He's the Logos. So Greek, but it's the living God of the Jews. I get excited. This is cool stuff. Translation. One of the things you'll see with movements is the vital necessity of this kind of translation of the gospel. Back in one of the movements we saw before the turn of the century at 2000 was when the Bible was translated into Bengali in 1980s. It was translated into Bengali, and instead of using the Hindu terminologies that had been used in the translation originally, they chose new Islamic terms for the same. And it became a vital backbone to one of the most powerful movements and turnings to Christ in the Muslim world. A translation that chose the right terminology. It's often considered dirty terminology. It's Muslim terminology. But we hear from Acts 10, don't call unclean what I have rendered clean. It's what we see in the interreligious terminology, first thing. Second thing we see is another dimension of language, call it devotional language. Here's how I learned this. I've been growing in this for years. When I first went to the city of Fez in Morocco, you get used to these calls to prayer. And they want to honor the old guys. And so you'll sit there in your bed at 5:45 in the morning, and you'll hear, it's like, oh gosh, guys, you can do better than that. Come on, you kind of get used to, they have the honor and they have to respect the old guys, but come on. So, over the years, I would, I'd hear this, I'd hear that, you kind of get, it's part of the furniture, I can still remember, it was probably a number of years into it, and I was lying there during Ramadan. I was down in Fez again, and a young guy was there in the morning as they woke and the fast began. And it was this melodic, dissonant, you've heard it before, but this kind of arabesque kind of aesthetic. And I sat there and I can still remember a thought to my head. I say, that's beautiful. I could see how that could become something that would become part of the devotional language of this people. You'd miss that beauty if you grew up in it. It was that kind of thinking, Didn't think too much about it until just a couple of years ago, just before COVID. I was over in Asia for a meeting. I was down in Southeast Asia, and some of these guys who represented movements in these other parts of the religious world, in this case, it was the Muslim world. One of these guys came and didn't know English. He was there and they said, why don't you come and share with us? There was a little bit of translation possibility. And so he went up and he kneeled before us. I think he had been a believer for maybe 3 or 4 years, but he was an imam. He was a religious leader in the Islamic community. And he had turned to Christ. And so he just said, I just want to pray with you. And he sat there cross-legged, and out came his beautiful Quranic. And this guy's an Indonesian. He speaks Indonesian. Out comes this beautiful Quranic, melodic, devotional. All of us, we almost had tears in our eyes, realizing the Spirit of God was just moving this guy, just his powerful testimony. And it's just Quranic Arabic and a beautiful, it's his devotional language. I can remember being we had meetings back a decade ago because all this stuff was hitting the fan. What are you gonna do with all this stuff, erupting in the Muslim world? Big controversy over contextualization and so forth. And so we had about 70 guys in a room. One of the guys was from Ethiopia. And they said, why don't you come up and share how you view the whole thing of language? Well, he was pretty passionate about this. And he made a case in front of us. He made his case. Whoa, I'm losing that time. He was making his case that the movements to Christ among the Muslim world need the freedom to use Arabic. Well, he's an Amharic speaker. He speaks Amharic, the Ethiopian language. And so he at one point, two men in the back rows from the Middle East, they were Middle Easterners. They didn't like hearing this. And they stood up and they said, but your mother tongue is Amharic. You have a word for God. Why don't you use your mother tongue? And I'll never forget the moment. This Ethiopian, Muslim background guy, looks at them and he says, Allah is my mother tongue. This is the word of my mother tongue for God. Don't chase me away from that word, please. I'll never forget the moment and the audacity The audacity of brothers from the Middle East who want to speak into his life and control how that devotional language emerges. I have to skip a lot the rest of my time, but one other issue of this whole thing that means so much to me is we had a wonderful brother. He used to be part of our Perspectives Thrust here, but he was from India, from a more upper caste background, and he had come to Christ here in the university structure and married a wonderful gal here, and he become part of the church over the last 35 years. He's been part of the Christian movement here and so forth. And I was with him, hearing him share recently, maybe a few years ago, that he had heard for the first time what had emerged in India with what they call the bhajans. Bhajan is basically a devotional kind of chant or music that happens in India. And some of the people within the Christian movement had stepped into the Hindu world and had developed basically Jesus-oriented bhajans. And they would sit in what they call a satsang, and they would simply sing devotional music to Jesus, because Jesus was their guy. This fit very fine into the Hindu world, this devotional language. And our brother here in Michigan, it was the first time he had heard bhajans. And he was saying to us, I was just paralyzed. I was stunned, because he had stepped into a Christian world that had a certain type of devotional orientation, a certain type of aesthetic, a certain way of singing. And when he heard this from his familiar world, it just spoke right down into his spirit. It paralyzed him. That world, Jesus comes into that world, can fill that out. So the whole subject of terminology and the inner religion, there's so much more to speak of here. We have time for just one more story. One of the things that happens in this is we in the West have taken religion and we've made it a compartment. You kind of have religion, anthropology, sociology, history, religion's over here. It's a subject matter. We can abstract it out, objectify it. For most of the world, religion is all fused with culture. You've got beliefs wrapping in with rituals, wrapping in with moral codes, wrapping in with practices and performances and spaces, special spaces you come from. There's the complexity, and you see this in Athens. There's a complexity to that religious world that Paul's in. He knows where he is. And this is what's true of most religious worlds. It's all this fused together. Religion is not a compartment. I can talk about my theology. No, it's all fused in to culture and life. But what happens with the separatist hermeneutic is that we've isolated and only talked about belief. This set of beliefs versus that set of beliefs. Leave out all the other dynamics. And I think we failed to see how God would do something like with Paul. He could see some things as he walked up into Athens. We can't see certain things. In our country of Morocco, most people in the mission movement before we got there in the 80s would never participate in anything that was Islamic in any way. They weren't part of weddings, they weren't part of funerals. Their friends could die, they weren't part of the funerals. They basically had a separatist orientation. It's a contrast. We are the gospel, that is not. That is dark, pagan, we do not participate. You fail to see the interreligious potential and opportunities in that situation. One that I had, I'll never forget this. We were in with a small team where one of the guys was tremendous in his language, was always, and he found something You'll remember this from either lesson 10 or 11, but he found an analogy. And it was a potent one. It wasn't Quranic, but it was very much part of their kind of religious culture. It was called the Sabua. And the Sabua happens every 8 days after a child is born. It's the naming ceremony. This is not in the Quran. It is just part of their life. And this friend of ours, John, he would talk to taxi cab. He said, hey, tell me about your Sabua. These guys would tell him about their Sabua. They were only 8 days old. He would tell them about their Sabua. How did he do that? Because the whole family would talk about that event. It was a very, very important rite of passage of his. And he would talk about who was there. My grandparents were there. He was 8 days old. It meant a lot to him. But John found something out. He found out that one of the things you do, and we knew this, but one of the things you do to make the significance of it is he would ask questions in this. And so he would lead guys into this. He would say, tell me about your Sabua. And he said, well, they sacrifice the lamb. What do you mean? They dibahu the lamb? Yeah. Well, why do they do that? He says, well, you see what they have, they have a big feast, and everybody comes, they want to eat, and they kill the, he says, well, why do they dibahu the lamb in particular? He says, well, he said, it's, he kind of keeps digging, and the guys are processing with him, and taxi cab driver, or someone who's a clerk or whatever, and he says, well, you see, he says, well, when you kill the lamb, why do you need to kill a lamb? He says, well, you need to understand that when my father slays the lamb, there's the drawing of blood. And that's important. And he utters something. He says, what's going on? He says, when he dibahus the lamb, he utters my name. And he says, well, what happens? He says, well, when he utters my name, you see, I become part of the family. Well, John says, you're already part of the family. He says, no, it's really symbolic. They have to, dibahu, there has to be the drawing of blood for me to be adopted into my family. John's got him. It's one of the most powerful things that you have. You have something within their religious culture that means so much to them. And you're able to turn on them and say, that's funny because, that's how we understand Jesus. What? He says, without the crucifixion of Jesus and the drawing of blood, we're unable to enter the family of God. Isn't that powerful? And my plea today is that this question of interreligious communication and the emergence of the church, there's so much else to say about the emergence of the church. Sorry, we just don't have time tonight, but I'm saying it, that this is the challenge in this next era, is to learn how to move and to get alongside those where God is moving in these other cultures and to see the movement of God in these places. This is a new question. It's a new hermeneutical process we're in. Every people, every place we go, there's going to be this hermeneutical process. If you're part of that world, even if you're working with the diaspora here, you're in a hermeneutical process with the Word of God. And one of the things that happens in that is, if you remember those triangles, is that the Bible speaking to us, the Bible speaking to them, but their world is now speaking back to us. We need to hear their voices. We need to hear what God's doing. We need to hear how God's appearing and what he's doing. So the hermeneutic is now involving the voice of the receptor culture. They're in another religious world. We need to hear those voices. We need to appreciate that, because that's what's going to make the difference in our ability to communicate. We see it in Paul, and we also see in Peter the exercise of a hermeneutical process that opened him to what God was going to do in another religious world. Thanks for the chance. I had so much I had to drop out. Just has so much to share tonight. I just thank you for the opportunity. My wife has put some of our periodicals over here, just different subject matters to come up with Mission Frontiers and that kind of thing you might want to take advantage of. Thanks, Joe, for inviting me. Appreciate it.